Hi, I'm John DeVore. Welcome to the channel. Today I want to talk a little bit about two of my vintage preamps. A few videos ago I talked about the love and the heartbreak of high-end audio. And I asked you to comment on whether or not you wanted to hear more from me about vintage hi-fi. And you responded in the comments with a resounding yes please. So I appreciate that. So today, earlier this week, I decided I would try to come up with something to kind of talk about, and I put in an SAE X1P preamp. This is like a 1980, 1981 era vintage preamp, solid state from SAE, Scientific Audio Electronics, to get it up and running. And lo and behold, I plugged it in, and it was out in one channel, or it was noisy in one channel. Everything was pulling to the left. Here we go, the heartbreak of vintage hi-fi. But I remembered that the first time, and I've owned this preamp less than a year, almost a year, but less than a year. I remembered that the first time I ever turned it on, it was a little flaky. It was not very good sounding, and I left it on overnight. And the next day, it worked perfectly and sounded much better. So I was patient. I went home, came back on Tuesday, listened to the preamp, and it sounded much better. It behaved well. Line stage balanced on both channels. Moving magnet input balanced on both channels. Moving coil input, which worked the last time I had this working, I had this plugged in, not working. Pulling to the left channel. This reminded me instantly of the only other piece of SAE I've ever owned, and that is the P101 preamp. This preamp is basically from the same time period as the X1P, but it was a more standard model. It was less expensive. It was much more widely available, and my SAE P101 preamp works perfectly. Line stage, moving magnet, all the inputs and outputs, filters, balance, mute, mono switch, which I love. Both of these SAE preamps have a mono switch, which I feel is important for people who listen to a lot of mono records and stuff. It also is out in the right channel in the moving coil stage, which tells me that both of these have a problem, maybe the same problem, in the head amp stage. So the head amp is the preamp stage before the actual phono preamp, the moving magnet phono section, where the equalization happens and additional gain is added. Interesting. An echo, my X1P echoing my P101. So I decide what am I gonna do? I'm gonna give the X1P another couple of days to maybe come around. In the meantime, I have an idea. Why don't I make a video and talk about the two SAE preamps and talk a little bit about SAE, the company, because I feel like there's a lot of vintage hi-fi companies that people really do know. Macintosh, people really know. People really know Marantz. People really know Harman Kardon Citation. People really know Fisher. People, there's a lot of brands out there that they really know. SAE is, as far as I can tell, it's a more obscure brand. So I thought I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to warm up both preamps. So I plugged in my P101 Wednesday, so it has been now cooking for 2 days. Played them both. The P101 sounded the same as I remembered it sounding a few months ago, last time, more than a few months ago, quite a while ago, last time I had it playing. Line stage, very good, nice clean detail, not full-bodied sounding. Moving magnet stage, again, very good, very clean, pretty quick, nice focus to it. The high frequencies in the phono section, in my opinion, are where the P101 starts to go wrong. They're not terrible after cooking for a day or two, but they are not perfect. They're a little bit grainy, and while there's good detail there, one of the things, and in my opinion, this is one of the hardest things for hi-fi to get right, is to have a lot of detail, but have that detail make sense in the context of the music, of the instruments that are there playing the music in the recording. So the P101, in my opinion, is presenting a good amount of detail, but that detail isn't really very well mapped to those instruments. It starts to sort of peel away from the instrumental timbre and from the dimensional soundstage and what is actually happening in the recording. Starts to peel away from that and starts to become detail as noise, as an artifact kind of the recording. And it starts to become detail noise rather than detail of a trumpet or of a reed player or of cymbals or brush on a snare, etc. And again, the moving coil, the head amp, is essentially non-functional. In comparison, the X1P is, aside from the moving coil head amp, which I find performs really very similar, sadly enough. The line stage is a considerable jump in performance from the line stage on the P101. It is richer in detail, but also richer in tonality. I feel like the instrumental timbres, those individual tonalities and textures that really sort of make each instrument in a recording its own thing, its own contributor to the overall. All of that is mapped a little bit better. So each of those instruments conveys a better sense of its own texture and its own timbre in that soundstage. All of the elements are definitely more full-bodied. There's a little bit less of a tip towards the high frequencies. In moving magnet, it is, I would say, slightly more tipped towards the high frequencies, but again, not bad. It's, I would say, still sounds great. There's no sense of that detail coming unglued from the music. All of it is mapping there. All of it is really helping to define and delineate and really sort of give some finesse to all of the stuff that's happening in the soundstage. Really excellent performance. Really great sounding. Moving coil, out. Heartbreak. All of the functions work well. All of the functions on both of those really do function very nicely. They work really well together. So why were there two preamps that sort of seem that similar? Functionality-wise, they're very similar. The interface on these is very similar. So these two preamps from SAE do not have any regular controls on the fronts. There are no knobs, there are no rotary controls or potentiometers on the front. There are no toggle switches or anything like that. No push button switches and nothing like that on either of these machines. All of the interface on these SAE preamps, all of it is done with these cool horizontal rocker switches. And the rocker switches, they activate momentary switches on the board right behind the faceplate and then send those control information to the audio circuits that are sort of towards the back of the chassis. The P101 was the first one to sort of come out with this kind of user interface. Before this, the SAE stuff, a lot of it had sliders, some of it had rotary controls. SAE was always a little weird. So after the earliest SAE pieces, the earliest SAE pieces all looked a lot like their inspiration. So in the mid-60s, SAE was founded in the mid-60s by this guy Morris Kessler and a buddy of his, and their mission statement, their goal was to make a solid state was brand new at the time, make a solid state amplifier that didn't sound solid state. They wanted to make a solid state amplifier that sounded as good as what was widely considered the absolute reference of amplifiers back then in the early 60s, mid 60s, a pair of Marantz Model 9s. Marantz Model 9s are vacuum tube mono amplifiers and were widely considered to be the best amplifiers of the era. So these guys, Morris and his friend, decided that was their challenge. They wanted to make an amplifier that was in that league. After they, in their own opinion, succeeded, they came out with, they founded their company, SAE. Their first product, the SAE Mark II, was that amplifier. Received rave reviews from none other than J. Gordon Holt, founder of Stereophile magazine. Again, this is in the 60s. And that got the ball rolling, and SAE became a company, came out with the Mark I, which is their preamp. And if you look at the Mark I preamp and the Mark II power amp, they are very clearly influenced by the corresponding Marantz preamp and power amp of the era. So that would have been the Marantz Model 7 or the Marantz Model 7T, the solid state version of the Model 7, which was tubes. Marantz Model 7T was also mid-60s. And these were console-style preamps that had a lot of controls on them, rotary controls, and then some toggles and things like that. And the amplifiers had analog meters, rectangular analog meters on the fronts. And the corresponding SAE components had that same thing. So very clear influence, very clear inspiration there. Gradually, SAE became weirder. They sort of went in their own direction, and they started to use more slider controls. Marantz definitely used slider controls, as did Harman Kardon Citation used some slider controls for some of the, they had like a little mini EQ, like tone controls on sliders. Marantz did a similar thing, and SAE started to take that even further, so that eventually they had equalizers, and they had preamps with big equalizer sections on them, and all of the controls, volume, tone controls, EQs, balance controls, all of it was done with these sort of horizontal sliders. And they really sort of had a unique look. They had mostly black faceplates at this time, screened with like blue and white lettering, red LEDs here and there. They had a very sort of high-tech look, and I always thought they were really cool looking. So in the 80s, when I was looking to put together really sort of a first high-end audio system, one of the components that I saw in ads that I always thought was really cool, and I read reviews on it, like an audio magazine, was the SAE 01 series. So the P101 preamp, which I have, was the preamp from the 01 series. They had an E101 equalizer, they had the 201 and 501 power amplifiers, T101 tuner, and they all had that same look. They all had the sort of rocker switch controls. They were all called computer controlled. The preamp is computer straight line preamplifier. They all seemed incredibly high tech and really cool, and I loved the way they all looked in a rack, all strapped into a rack with that same really cool look, red displays on them, red and white screening and text on the fronts. Just very cool. I always thought it was really cool, and the reviews always said that they were great sounding. They were sort of really fun to use. I know that truthfully they literally have zero knob feel, because there are literally no knobs anywhere on either of these preamps. But in the sense of knob feel that I'm talking about, using those rocker switches and feeling those relays click in the back and having the lights come on and all that, they really are really nice to use. They have a really beautiful user interface. The displays are very nice. When you turn them on from standby, they come in and they say SAE in the display. They just feel so advanced. And so I always wanted one. I never had one until a few years ago. I got a good deal on a P101 and grabbed it. And to be frank, the MC section never worked, and it never sounded good enough to stay in the system for longer than a couple of weeks. Then I saw an X series preamp. I saw a photograph of an X series preamp. I saw a photograph of the X1P. I never knew it existed. I had no idea that this thing existed. So the X series, it was basically the 01 series made as more of the modern high-end audio type of component. So if you remember what I was just talking about, in the 80s, high-end audio didn't mean Marantz or Macintosh so much, or Harman Kardon citation. The high end was now Audio Research. It was Conrad Johnson. It was Mark Levinson. It was Krell. It was Threshold. These were the brands that now represented high-end audio. So what the X series of SAE is essentially it's the O1 series brought to compete with that new aesthetic and that new build quality and that new level of sophistication and that new level of performance. So with the X series is very slim compared to the O1 series, and the reason that they can do that is because they took the power supply out of the main chassis and made it remote. So the power supply is in its own separate box, and there's an umbilical that connects the two. The power supply essentially is the noisiest part of a preamp for the most part. The power supply is what's directly connected to the power coming out of your wall. So there is hum and noise coming out of that wall. There's hum at 60 hertz, or for people outside of the US, 50 hertz. And that hum can be picked up by the delicate circuitry within the actual audio circuit. So by moving it to an outboard power supply, which is what the Krell preamp of the time, the PAM1, had, which is what the Levinsons had, the ML7, the ML6, they all had outboard power supplies to sort of isolate that noisy component from the rest of the quiet circuits within the chassis. So the X does that. They clearly do some other things, because the X absolutely sounds better in every way than the O1 series. One of the other cool things about SAE is, along the way, one of the major luminaries of high-end audio design passed through SAE. So passed through SAE through the 70s. His name was James Bongiorno. So the earliest stuff was designed by Morris Kessel and his partner, but after not too long, James Bongiorno came. And James Bongiorno had worked at a company called Hadley under Mr. Hadley, who I think he had Parkinson's late on. So I think James Bongiorno was working very closely with Hadley on really very, very well regarded 1960s amps and preamps. He was already a rising star in high-end audio. So he came on board SAE and contributed mightily to SAE's lineup over the years. I don't know, he did leave SAE to found another, maybe more famous, another very well-regarded company, GAS, Great American Sound, where he made a legendary amplifier called Ampzilla. You definitely can get a sense of where he came from, because the Ampzilla and its matching preamp, the Thedra, both very clearly had aesthetic ties to the SAE gear of the time. The Ampzilla had, again, those two rectangle meters on it, very much like the SAE amplifiers of the time. The Thedra preamp was a console-style preamp with a lot of slider controls and a lot of controls on it, rack handles, and it also looked very much like the SAE preamps of the time. And he continued on. So after that, Mr. Bongiorno went on. Apparently, Great American Sound, he had a lot of issues with his partners there, and I think it was probably maybe similar to what happened to Levinson with the Mark Levinson company. Bongiorno got investors in for shares of the company, and they, from what I've read, forced him out. And so he then started another company called Sumo in the late 80s. And I remember Sumo in the late 80s, in the 90s, and I coveted them. So he made some really cool slimline preamp tuner. He made a tuner called Charlie the Tuner. Preamp was the Athena preamp, Andromeda power amp, Polaris power amp, I think it was called. And they were excellent products. Excellent sounding, really cool aesthetic, really nice knob feel. Andy made a pure Class A amplifier, very, very cool shit. Those amplifiers are great sounding, the Class A ones especially. Keep an eye out for those. And then Sumo went under at some point. Sumo didn't last long, sadly. And he went on, he released a new version of the Ampzilla, but then also was involved in a lot of other projects all the way up until he was involved in HiFi through the aughts, and had a hand in the reference Constellation gear. Constellation, a company that is very much still around. He was also a fascinating dude. I remember seeing him for the first time in the mid '90s at a hi-fi show, at the Hi-Fi show in New York City. But I saw him. I didn't know who he was, but I asked later on, and he was very distinctive looking. He was absolutely he was a colorful character, and by colorful I mean he wore an amazing outfit. He had a jaunty fedora, and he had a pastel color suit. My memory was that it was like a dusty rose color, a ruffled shirt, bow tie. I'm pretty sure it was a three-piece suit. He did not look like anyone else at a hi-fi show, and I remember that. And I met him once at a show in Las Vegas. This was after I started my company. I remember seeing him at the show in Vegas at the Saint-Tropez, and again, dressed incredibly well. He passed away 10 or so, maybe almost 15 years ago now, but left a pretty awesome legacy behind him. So the record that I'm going to play on the outro is one of the 3 or 4 records that I used just to listen to the 2 preamps over the last couple of days. So one of the records that I did use as a tool that I am not going to play for you is one that I use sometimes to get a sense of how well a hi-fi component is dealing with the high frequencies. And it's a 60s pressing. It's a concert disc, Brahms string quartet. It's the Fine Arts Quartet. And it is, the violins on this are definitely not polite sounding. And on the P101 preamp, they were unbearable. On the X1P preamp, they are very much listenable, and you can hear, if possibly a little bit too much, you can hear that hot mix of those violins on that recording. It was fully listenable on the X1P. But the record that I'm going to play on the outro is a Nick Bartsch record. Nick Bartsch, this is one of his groups called Ronin. He makes some really, really good solo piano records, but I knew that I wanted to have multiple instruments, and this one, so there's a reed player, bass clarinet, and alto sax. I love the woody sound of a bass clarinet, so I wanted that in there. This bass player really also, he's a very melodic bass player. There's a lot sort of going on his bass lines, so I knew that would be useful in evaluating, and a drummer, just a great drummer. This record has a lot of texture on it, and so you can hear whether or not that's coming through in the transparency of the system. And in this case, the X1P, very transparent, really beautiful sounding. So Nick Bartsch, Ronin Awase. Thank you for watching. Oh, what do you want me to do? So for the next Vintage Hi-Fi video, I'm going to, I think what I want to do, which will be kind of fun, is to now bring a different preamp in. So the P101 is going to go out, it's going to go back in its box, and another preamp is going to come in. I'm going to keep the X1P plugged in and warm, and let's compare it with another one. I could compare it with the standard that inspired the founding of the company of SAE, so I could compare it to my solid-state Marantz Model 7T, or I could compare it to its contemporary. I could compare it to, so that the 7T was originally 1966, something like that. So that's a preamp that is from at least 15 years before the X1P. Or I could compare it to one of its contemporaries from the beginning of the 80s, and that would be, in my collection, that would be the Krell PAM 1. Krell PAM 1 actually has a very similar form factor to the X1P. Outboard power supply, solid-state, slimline chassis, really beautiful construction, and really from the same era. Let me know. Maybe eventually I'll do both, but let me know which one you guys want me to prioritize. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you at the next video. And these cats...